Welcome to Sincerely Me, a podcast about self-discovery and inner work so you can cultivate a deeper relationship with yourself and show up more fully in your work and life. My name is Tallia and I'm honored to be your host. Hello there, everyone. Today's podcast episode is full of so many truth bombs. I am here with Miss Tiffany Han and wanted to do a quick intro before I let you all hear the conversation her and I had about speaking your truth, embracing criticism, voicing judgment. I mean, goodness, there's a lot in this episode. So grab a piece of paper and a pen or your iPhone and jot some notes down. So just for some background, Tiffany is the podcast host of Raise Your Hand, Say Yes, and a certified life coach. She writes, she teaches, she speaks, and she's most interested in telling the truth about a life of chasing your dreams, tangles included. She works day in, day out on her mission to help smart and ambitious women raise their hands and say yes to all of the things they want to do without compromising their standards and sanity. Needless to say, we had a lot to talk about. And as you'll hear in the beginning of the episode, I reached out to her because she posted a very, very, very powerful image and caption on Instagram not too long ago, and that really serves as the basis of this conversation. So I hope you enjoy, and without further ado, here's my conversation with Tiffany Han. I would love for us to just kind of jump right in and start with this one Instagram post that prompted me to reach out to you. I've been a fan of your work for a long time, but the minute I read this Instagram post, I had to have you on the podcast to have a conversation about speaking your truth, the power of voicing criticism, dealing with judgment. So yeah, I'd love for us to start with a story of kind of what happened and where this all started.
Yeah. So the backstory on this is that I too am a podcaster, and I have been podcasting since mid 2014. I started my podcast, Raise Your Hand, Say Yes. And you know, it's a whole journey when you create work in the public space. But the post that I put up on Instagram that prompted this conversation was a 1-star review that I had gotten. So I'll just read it to you. It's from somebody who had a alias name. And actually, the irony of it was that it was posted on my 39th birthday, which was an extra little jab. But the title of the 1-star review said obnoxious. And it said, wow, Tiffany Han is obnoxious. I couldn't even get through an entire episode. Her voice is like nails on a chalkboard. And what I said about it was that, you know, there will always be people who don't like your work. There will always be people who disagree with you. I think it's actually really interesting that that person also very specifically referenced my voice, because one of the things I hear from people all the time is, I would love to have a podcast, but I hate the sound of my own voice. And so sometimes it is really interesting to get criticism that we think to ourselves mirrored back to us. But then I also went into detail about how many people have told me that my podcast has literally changed their life. And, you know, were I to listen to this one point of criticism, I would not have the opportunity to impact so many other people in a really positive way.
Yeah. And I think, this is powerful for so many reasons. The first thing that comes to mind for me is how, for most of us, our biggest fear is criticism this way, not just hearing it, but like seeing it in such a public way. It's terrifying. And I think, most reactions would tend to be you either try to get it removed or you report it. I don't even know if you can do that, but trying to just hope and dream and wish that, I hope no one sees this, and I never want anyone to, read these words or think this about me. But you did the exact opposite thing and brought it to this forefront. You put a spotlight on it. Mm-hmm. And I want to know what prompted that. What was the why behind that reaction, and what was the process that you went through from seeing it, reading it, and then getting to a point of owning it and just releasing it in the way you did?
Yeah. So to be clear, this came in on October 29th, 2018. And then I posted about it on June 5th, 2019. So there were a few months there. And I think the first time I saw it, I was looking something up on my own podcast, and I happened to be in the podcast app and saw it. And my immediate reaction was shame and embarrassment and thinking, oh my God, this exists and other people are going to be able to see it too, coupled with, why am I such a failure? Right. It sort of is like, I knew I was bad at this. Why am I doing this? And I didn't react. What I did, it was actually because on iTunes, you can like click on user profiles. So I clicked to see what else this person had reviewed because I'm always very curious about that. And I was like, okay, well, I know inherently this is not my person, but I didn't really do anything else about it. I got a little bit defensive and then I realized that wasn't helping. And as time went on, I kept seeing it. Like every time I'd look for something on my podcast or go to look up an episode number to reference to give to somebody if they were asking for a specific podcast, I kept seeing it. And I also kept having conversations. Part of my job and part of your job is to always be talking to people, always be having conversations. And I'm always so curious about what's getting in people's way. And as you mentioned, that idea of the fear of rejection, the fear of criticism is often something that will hold people back. And so part of my job, I think, is to show people that things are survivable and show people that they can do scary things. And so for me, every time I saw it, it kind of just chipped away at me until I was like, you know what? I'm going to take the power away from this and I'm going to shine a spotlight on it, like you said, so that it no longer is a point of shame for me, so that I no longer have to wonder if other people have seen it. I'll just put it out there and then we've all seen it and we can all talk about it and then I can move on from it.
Yes, I love that. And I do think it's important too to recognize that there was a time, the time did pass between when you saw it and when you actually decided to do something about it. But the process that you went through from point A to point B is probably where so much of that kind of inner work was able to take place, where you went through the stages, right? You started at shame, but you didn't let it take over. You decided when it was time to reclaim a little bit of power. And it's such a beautiful strength to be able to see in somebody else, but to also know that you've now kind of given this example and shown people that it's possible to claim that power and live out loud and not shrink in the face of criticism.
Yeah. Yeah. Because if I say it first, then it can't be used to hurt me.
Right. Yeah. And something that I talk a lot about too in my coaching is that we tend to look for evidence and proof that validates our fear. So in a situation like this, right, you see a comment or a post and it immediately validates whatever fears or kind of negative narratives we've played in our minds. But to your point too, there was so much proof and validation for the opposite thing too, which is, this is the best podcast ever. You've changed my life. So much positivity has been surrounded, or your podcast has been surrounded by so much positivity, as has your work. But the minute the one criticism comes in, you forget all the good things.
Right. And isn't that so easy to do?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think part of it is that our brains are hardwired to sense danger and to want to keep us safe. I think that's how humans have survived through all of these years. And so I think that part of that is that it's just an animal instinct to do that. But also, I think that we forget that as humans with reason and ration, that we don't have to, we don't have to let that shame win. And we don't have to let shame and fear be the drivers of the things that we do and how we proceed.
Absolutely. So I'm curious to know, for someone who might be sitting in a place of feeling judged or just surrounded by, people who are constantly criticizing, or and maybe that judgment's just self-judgment, right? Maybe it's just their own narratives in their own mind. What's the first step you'd recommend for someone to help them get out of that just kind of dark space of judgment, whether it's, again, self-judgment or coming from outside of them?
I always like to, one of the exercises that I have my students do for almost every class I teach is I have them write a future fan mail letter to themselves. So I have them imagine that they're 5 years down the road and write a letter from a fan and have that letter describe how they've impacted this person, what they've taught them, how their life is different because of them. Because here's the thing, Tallia. I mean, you know this too, right? If you're in a public space, you will be judged, period. Like, we are judgmental. And I think that I wish I could say, it doesn't matter. Like, you won't be judged. It doesn't matter. It's not as bad. But sometimes those judgments come in the door and sometimes they sting. And, part of the thing that I really try to work on for myself and also try to teach people to do is to see the greater purpose in what they're doing so that when the judgment shows up, they have something more powerful to help them move forward and to help them keep going.
Totally. That perspective is so important, but the first thing we tend to lose in moments like that.
I know. Well, and we can't, we can't trust our brains in the moment.
Totally. Our minds are, animals.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And, again, the brain is wired for safety, but I think the brain is also wired for comfort and efficiency. And so anything that feels like trying to paddle upstream, again, our bodies would prefer not to.
Yeah.
And, part of that thing, because when that comment got posted, when that review got posted back in October, I didn't see it right away because I actually try not to read my reviews unless somebody like screenshots it and sends it to me, which is great. But for the most part, I try not to look at it because I also know that it gets into my head. And it was a couple months before I saw it. So the other thing that I told myself as I was kind of trying to be like, it's okay, just keep going, was, there were 2 months when that review was posted and published and public and available for people to see that I kept going, which told me like, you survived the review. So it wasn't a thing that was like, oh, I'm just a failure, right? It wasn't somebody coming and like taking away my podcasting credentials.
Totally. Yeah. It's like, what if I hadn't read it, if I hadn't stumbled upon it, nothing would have changed for me.
Right. Yeah.
I would have still kept doing the work and still kept having the impact I've been having with the people I've been working with. That was one of the questions that a friend asked me. I was going through some anxieties and stresses and different things were kind of coming up in my life. And that's the first question she asked me. She said, well, what does this change? Like, what does knowing this thing or seeing this thing actually change in the way you're going to move about your day to day? And it was such a powerful question because it changed absolutely nothing.
Right. And really, I mean, I don't know about you. I'd be curious your take on this, but like, I have doubt all the time.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah. It never goes away.
No. So this is just another flavor of that. And, I think that's also important to talk about because we think it's so easy to look at the stories that other people are telling on Instagram where we're getting these snippets and these moments of somebody's life and think, oh, well, that person has it all figured out. And if only I had it all figured out. And I think that all figured out piece is such a myth. I don't know anybody who has things all figured out.
Yeah. It's assuming there's like an endpoint, right? It's like,
well, exactly. The endpoint is death. So I don't want to get there.
Right. I speak about the topic of success a lot. And my point in the beginning is always like, when will you know you've achieved success? Like, is there a point where you'll be done? Like, what does that day look like?
Yeah. So what does that look like for you?
The way we define success, that's where we have to start. Because I think, sure, if I define success by, okay, I will have achieved success when I, fill 10 spots for my coaching program, or when I reach, 5,000 downloads per podcast episode, whatever it might be. It's then what's next is the question you're always left with, right? It's never enough. Like, how is that going to be your definition of success unless you're aware enough that it's always changing and there's always going to be another thing. I
Mm-hmm.
think for me, when I think about success, what I think about more so is reaching a point where I'm living a quality of life that's fulfilling and meaningful and purposeful to me. And, from a lot of the positive psychology research, when we think about quality of life, there are kind of 5 essential components that give rise to a high quality of life. And that for me has really helped determine really what my own definition of success looks like. And it changes daily, right? Like it's never the same, but it's always comprised of a positive emotion. So wanting to feel something good in my day and being driven by what that emotion is. It's driven by engaging with something or with someone in a way that feels challenging and in a way that feels like it's adding value to someone. It's doing something that I feel like matters, whether it's to me or somebody else. And it's always connected to, at the end of the day, how I feel about myself and what my relationship to myself looks like. If that's not built on a strong foundation, if I don't feel connected to myself on a deeper level, the definition of success I'm striving for is probably not my own.
Yeah. Yeah. And, then the other piece is if all of those things are being met and you're really connected with yourself in that way and with your life, like the impact that you're going to be able to have is about so much more than number of downloads for a podcast.
Yeah. Right. Because, and, we tend to identify with all these external things that again are so temporary in nature, and we forget how temporary they are.
Yeah.
We forget how temporary they are. And, that's where the constant, the chasing for happiness, like it's this false narrative that we buy into that once I have this thing, once I make this money, once I hit this goal, then I will feel happy. Then I will feel fulfilled. Then I'll be lovable or deserving or worthy or whatever it is you tell yourself, when that's just so not where what we're looking for actually comes from.
Yeah. So here's a question that I think about a lot and that I get a lot. I'm curious about your take. How do you balance what you just talked about, which is this idea that like external success, quote unquote success, isn't going to make or break me? How do you balance that with also being an ambitious, driven, capable, smart woman who like wants to make an impact and wants to do big things and setting goals and all of that, but without letting them define you?
Yeah. Oh, that's such a good question. I don't know if I have a direct answer, but I'll start thinking out loud with you on it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
I'm always just so curious how people
yeah.
manage it. And also, right, how do you create this success without sacrificing your sanity? I mean, that's like the underlying question of everything I'm doing right now. And so I'm always like, how do people and how do like in general, but also individuals get that done?
So something that brings up for me is the power of intention and knowing the why behind the goals. There's nothing wrong with goal setting and wanting to achieve certain things and wanting to hit these different, benchmarks and metrics, but why? What is it that is fueling? What's the motivation? What's the intent behind it is the first kind of place my head goes. And then I think in terms of balancing day to day, what I've found to be the only thing, honestly, that keeps me kind of grounded is learning how to be present and mindful in everything that I do.
Yeah.
And not living in the past of what was, not living in the future of what could be, or worrying about what could go wrong or any of that, but really just practicing presence and knowing that I have all that I need now and that my life is abundant. At the same time, there are absolutely things that I am working towards, but those aren't going to, it's not if they happen, then I will. It's here's where I'm at now, and here's what all of it's working towards, if that makes sense.
Totally. Yeah. So in a way, I read The Power of Now earlier this year. Or last year. I read it maybe last fall. I don't know. That book like blew my mind. And I also couldn't believe that it had taken me this long.
Also, I'm in the middle of it for the second time now. And I'm just like, how how do people live without reading this book?
And I thought that too. And then I thought, because on the cover it says like over however many millions sold.
Right.
And I was like, if all the people who have bought this book actually read it, our world would not be in the condition that it's in right now.
Totally.
But I mean, I think I had a lot of light bulbs as I was reading that, even around this question of goal setting, where if you're remaining in the present, it's not like you just are complacent and you give up, but it's that you're letting the, as he talks about, like the nowness, right? You're letting that guide your decisions so that you're not setting goals from a place of fear, but you're setting the goals from a place of like love and having enough and being enough and knowing enough and all of that.
Yeah. It's connecting to the wholeness and wholeness is the best word I can really use there. It's like if you find the time to get quiet and find stillness, you realize that everything you think will come from the things you're chasing after they've been there all along.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's such a faith piece to that though, because I think that we're taught to do more and work harder and, that we're not enough and that all of our worth comes from our actions.
From doing.
Yeah. And so there's a whole reprogramming required.
Yeah. And I think so much of it is going back to fear or faith. Is it coming from fear? Is it coming from faith? And knowing that it's such a practice. I mean, it's one thing to read the book and know these things, but it's another to actually be able to put it into practice and kind of shift your mindset around so many of these things that, to your point, we've learned how to do or how to be. And it's like, it's an unlearning and a relearning almost that takes time.
Yeah. Yeah. One thing that I learned a few years ago that kind of blew my mind that might be helpful in the like fear faith conversation too. And this kind of goes back to that original thing of showing up and shining a spotlight on those pieces that might hurt a little. I interviewed Janelle Hanchett for my podcast, and she's a writer. She writes a blog called Renegade Mothering, and she published a memoir called I'm Just Happy to Be Here about her struggles with addiction. She actually, at one point lost custody of her children because of her struggles with addiction and how she kind of worked through those and got to where she is now. And one of the things that I was asking her in the podcast was, what do you do? Like, what do you do when you're afraid to write things, when you're afraid to tell your truth? Because she is such a truth teller. And she said, because I was thinking of faith and fear as like two different ends of the spectrum. And what she said was, you're always putting your faith into something. And so if you're letting the fear hold you back, it's not that fear is the bad guy. It's that we are actively putting our faith in that fear. We are telling that fear, you know more than I do. You are smarter than me. You have the crystal ball. You know how this is going to end. And I am going to believe that. Rather than putting our faith in ourselves, in trusting that we're going to be okay, in our capabilities and our capacity. And I think to me that every time it feels like fear is starting to win, right? That is something that I tell myself. And it really, really helps kind of stop me in my tracks and refocus and recollect my feelings of like, I'm not going to let fear win. I'm not going to actively put my faith into that. I'm going to put my faith into something else.
Yeah. And again, it's such an active practice, and it takes showing up for yourself and really being able to look at what you're allowing to get in your own way and admit to it, and not attached to what's gotten you to where you are, and not judge it, because the judgment becomes just another block that gets in our way of moving to the next place.
Yeah. Yeah. And it erodes everything you've done. Right. So like I just today recorded my 252nd podcast episode, but if I let that one review, Pepperjack 240, determine my worth and my value, then what has the past almost 5 years been for? It's interesting too, because I think often when we talk about fear, it's easy to picture fear. The fear voice is like this big giant dragon monster in the room. And often, often for me, that fear voice just sounds like me. And so I think that sometimes even just being able to step back and pay attention, right? Eyes open and be like, wait a minute, this voice that I've become very comfortable with, that's become very familiar to me may not be serving me. And that can sometimes be a really rude awakening. It's sort of like when as you're an adult and you realize like, oh, that thing that my parents said to me all the time that I thought was really motivating actually was like eroding my self-esteem. And so it can feel jarring, but I think that getting to the heart of that, it's this whole idea of like going into the scary parts and leaning into that truth. I think it only makes you stronger.
Yeah, absolutely. Easier said than done, but 100%. 100%. I want to know how so you have this program, 100 rejection letters. And I want to know more about it because it's obviously related to what we've been talking about in terms of embracing rejection and not letting the fear of rejection get in the way of asking for what you want. So tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah. And actually, my 100 rejection letters project is how I connected with Kate for your conference last summer that I spoke at. So that was a direct result of my 100 rejection letters, my own personal 100 rejection letters quest. So this is a class that I teach, but the idea came about back in 2012 when I was first getting started in my coaching business. I was blogging and I was reading Julia Cameron's The Artist Way. And one of the chapters in that book was about getting over the fear of rejection as an artist and as a creative. And I read it and got super fired up and then did what you did back in the day. I immediately wrote a blog post about it because Instagram was not what it is now. Then today, modern time, I would post about it on Instagram. And I made a commitment to get 100 rejection letters. And for me, it was all about like, I'm going to kind of put myself out there for any potential opportunity. And I won't stop until I get to 100 rejection letters. It reminded me a lot of when I was in middle school, I rode horses, and my riding instructor would always say that you had to fall off the horse 7 times to be a good rider. And so every time I fell off, she'd be like, well, you're one fall closer, and it took the sting out of the fall and made you excited to get back up on the horse.
You knew it was accepted as a part of the process.
Exactly. Yeah. And in fact, if you weren't falling off the horse, then were you riding to your full potential? My husband is a skier and he's always like, sometimes you crash, right? Sometimes you fall. It's just part of the sport. It's part of the game. And so what I did back in 2012 is I essentially, any opportunity that came my way, I put myself out there for. So, somebody's doing a giveaway. I'm going to apply for that. Oh, you need speakers. I'm going to apply for that. Oh, you need guest bloggers. I'm going to apply for that. And it radically changed my life. And so starting in 2014, I started teaching it because the method, what I found is that by gamifying rejection, and I literally, every person who takes the class gets a gold star tracker, like a rejection tracker to keep on their wall, and they get gold star stickers. Because by giving yourself a gold star, right, in terms of psychology and behavior modification, that gold star is actually reinforcing the behavior. So through this process, either you get a gold star if you get a no, which is a reward in your brain, or you get a yes, which is also a reward in your brain.
I love that. Wow. And to do it in a way that holds you accountable. I mean, accountability is the biggest thing, right? Is like, you can say you're going to do it, but until you really have to do it, you're going to sit in the comfort. You're going to sit in you're going to sit in the comfort and the fear.
Yeah. Yeah. Or you're going to just wait around and hope for the best.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right. Which is, I think, how it looks like a lot of people got to where they are now. because again, you're not seeing the struggle and the work behind it. And one of the things that I teach in this class is my process for building relationships with people and pitching them, and what to do before you send a pitch, and how to connect with people. And they always come back and they're like, wow, that's a lot of work.
Yeah.
And I'm like, yeah, it is, because it's not, there are millions of people doing similar things. Yeah. And so if you want to stand out, you have to pave that road. And some of it, I think, is luck, but I think a lot of it is saying, this is where I want to be, and I'm willing to put in the investment to get there.
Yeah. And committing to it.
Yeah.
Speaking of committing to things, from following you on Instagram and looking at your stories and your Instagram posts themselves, I want to talk a little bit about your commitment to living out loud. And I put that in notes, but I've seen you use that phrase and use those words, and it's such a powerful, it just resonated with me so much recently, because through my own kind of inner work and journey through self-development, getting to know kind of what's holding me back, I realized that a lot of what's holding me back is just, partly tied to comfort, partly tied to fear, but more of the tendency that I know a lot of other women have to, and I don't want to say play small, because I feel like that's overused a lot, but just to kind of like linger in the background and not really take up the space we know we want to take up, or that we deserve to take up. Yeah. So this idea of living out loud and kind of like putting ourselves out there, not necessarily in terms of like, not, and that doesn't have to mean in the way we share and what we share, but more in the courage we have to own our story and not hide anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. And to initiate telling our story ourselves. Right. And for me, a lot of that is about telling my story in the moment rather than waiting for it to have some kind of resolution. And some of that, right? Like we talked about with that 1-star review in the beginning, that took me a few months before I shared. But often, when I write, like especially on Instagram, most of my Instagram posts are not things that I sit down and draft and say, today I'm going to write an Instagram post. They're typically things that come to me in the moment, and I will get on my computer and I tend to write my captions in my iPhone notes app. So I'll type them up on my computer, and a lot of times I type them and I'm like, all right, that's good. Let's post it. Because that, for me, that energy of like, oh, this is kind of burning through me. It's something that I need to be said. And I always tell people, like, start telling your story before people ask to hear it. I think that we have been programmed to kind of stay in the shadows and hide and just be available should anyone need us. And I think that's some BS. I think that, we all have stories. And so many times I hear people say, well, my life hasn't been hard enough to have a story worth telling, or other people have stories that need to be heard more than mine. And I think that sometimes, yes, we can use our own platforms to shine lights on other people's stories, but the more that we're able to tell our stories as they are, the more we show that stories matter.
Yes. Okay. So many points. The first thing, I love the distinction between telling your story once you've gotten to a resolution, like once everything ended okay, versus telling your story while you're in the middle of it. Mm-hmm. That's such a powerful distinction. And I think this maybe is a silly example, but I remember being in a workout class once, and she told us there were like 30 seconds left, and all of us started working that much harder because we knew when it was going to end. The certainty helped us push ourselves. And she just tied it so beautifully to this kind of bigger metaphor in life, which was, is it only when you have the security and certainty of how things are going to end that you're going to push yourself? how is that like, how is that a way to live? Right. And so I think it's, to your point, like telling your story before you know how it's going to end, and trusting, having faith in the process of it all. And then also knowing that authenticity is going to relate so much more with people than perfection is. And when we're looking for the perfect end to our story, it's not going to have the impact we could, it could have with folks. Not to say that we're only sharing for the goal of it having an impact, but when you show what's possible through storytelling in an authentic way, it absolutely has an impact on other people.
Yeah. And I think there's real power to kind of showing up to your life and saying, this is currently happening and it's really hard, period. Because I don't know anybody in this world who doesn't hear that and like have a deep exhale of, okay, thank you. I thought it was just me. Right. And those pieces, I heard Brene Brown say once that the things that we are most afraid to share out loud are like the exact connection points that other people are looking for with us. And if you've ever been at like a networking event or something and everybody else is talking about the weather and they're all making small talk, and you look at one person who like pulls you aside and is like, oh my God, this terrible thing happened. Or, oh my God, I just need to tell somebody about this, whether or not it's terrible. Right. But all of a sudden you meet those people that are willing to just go there with the truth. And it is for me at least, it always just puts me at ease because I'm like, oh, good. We're in it. Um, and so for everyone listening too, think about those times in your life when that's occurred. And I think that helps give me the courage in the moment to, just speak things out loud.
And to just know that you're not the only one. I mean, I know you say that a lot too. It's like, you're not alone. You're not the only one. You're not alone. Life is hard. We're going to get through it. We've been going through it.
Yeah.
We can do it.
Exactly. Because I just said this to a class I was teaching earlier today. I just said, like, we have all survived 100% of the challenges we've been handed by life.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Right? Because you're here, you're listening to this podcast, like on a little computer somewhere. That's magical. And so it's so easy to just get caught in our heads. And I get it because the things that are going on inside of our lives feel really big. And, it's so easy to just get caught in that churn. One thing I also try to do is literally live out loud with my husband. Like he and I have been together for, a dozen years. And so we're very close, and obviously we've done a lot of things together and all of that, but it's very, very easy for me to just get in my head about things. And I also it's easy for me to convince myself that like he's not interested in my work life because all my work is done online and a lot in social media, and he's not an online person. He's not on social media at all. He and I are opposites in a lot of ways, but it really is something that I've had to force myself to practice saying out loud. So when he says, "How was your day?" I don't just say, "Fine." Instead, I'm like, "Okay, well, let me tell you exactly what I did, even if I have a story that you think it's boring," because that's my belief system, but it's not necessarily true.
Yeah. Yes. And that's such a powerful question that I encourage a lot of folks to ask themselves too is what you're thinking based in truth, or is it a story your mind has made up?
Yeah.
And how can you go back to truth? How can you not just, and not just go back to it, but speak it, voice it, and stay as aligned with it as you can, knowing that when in alignment with your truth, and this is like a little Gabrielle Bernstein of me, but like that's when the universe can conspire to support you, because you're doing your job. You're playing your part in getting to know what your truth is and speaking it and putting it out into the world. The rest, that part you can control. The rest of it, you just have to trust that it'll meet you halfway.
Yep. And it is vulnerable, right? Like it is vulnerable to put something out there that is potentially big or scary. And I've shared a lot of like out loud vulnerable things, and it never stops being vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
But what you realize on the flip side, on the other side of it, is that it also is this really deep point of connection that's available. And so in that way, you trust that, but you don't wait for it to be easy.
Yeah. Yeah. Because we'll find all the excuses in the world to wait just one more day.
Exactly.
Just one more. It'll be easier tomorrow. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I would love for us to transition a little bit and talk about one of the questions I pose to most of my guests who come onto the podcast is about living a life of significance and how differently we all define that. And so I'd love to know from your experience in life and the work you do, what to you does it mean to live a life of significance?
Yeah, I love that question. And I think for me, it actually has a lot to do with staying present. And it's about me letting myself lead from the room I'm in. And what I mean by that is, I think it's so easy to get, especially these days, like bogged down in how many terrible things are happening on this planet. And I also think these terrible things have been happening forever. We're just, some of us are just becoming more aware of them now. And it's very easy to get overwhelmed by that and to feel powerless. And when I think about, for me, what kind of impact I want to have and how I want to be of service to the world, which is to me living a life of significance, I think about the people that I get to speak to every day. I think about my students that I get to work with all the time. And I also think about like I have 5-year-old twin daughters. I think about them and I think about what kind of experience I get to help instill in them and how I get to also be a model of what it's like to be a woman in this world and walk through this world and telling my truth and standing in that truth. And so for me, I really try to focus on the here and now and what I can do with the life that I've been given, rather than telling myself that I'm not doing enough or just letting myself feel paralyzed by all of the things that aren't done by me by the end of the day because of bandwidth or resources or any of that.
I love that. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
And if you could go to any point in time or stay in the present, up to you, and talk to yourself, write a letter to yourself, what would you say and where in time would you go?
Oh gosh, I think I would want to like give this to myself from like every moment from probably like high school until yesterday. If I could just like drop little letters to myself out of an airplane. And I think that what I would want myself to know is just everything will be okay. There's always things that challenge us. And I am a bit of an anxious person and I'm definitely a worrier. And I'm also super ambitious and the overachiever, which I think is probably fueled by my anxiety. And a lot of times that has kept me thinking that the only way I can be of value is by doing more. And so the idea that not only is everything going to be okay, but that like my value is not dependent on how much I do. That is what I'd want myself to know. And honestly, that's what I tell myself every day right now. Because it's an important thing for me to remember, but it also is something that is so easy to forget.
Yeah. And it's funny how often, I want to say maybe 90% of the people who I have on, when they think about the letter or what they would say to themselves, almost everybody says, it's going to be okay.
Yeah. Sorry. The dog is chiming in. Yeah, because I think that there is, again, our brains conflate discomfort with danger. And we get to also be like, you know what, maybe it's fine. And that whole thing that you were mentioning earlier about is something a long-term problem, or is it just a blip on the radar right now? And I think that's another thing that I think about a lot is it going to matter in 5 years? And if not, I can move on from it. I would hope everyone listening who also needs that reminder, that the fact that you need that reminder doesn't mean that you're doing it wrong. It just means that you're human.
Amazing, amazing, amazing. Could not have said it better myself. That was my lovely conversation with the awesome Tiffany Han. If you want to find out more about her and what she's up to, you can check her out using all the links in the show notes. She's got an amazing Instagram with some super dope content, so check that out. And yes, we are 1 week closer to the Inner Work Circle. So the Inner Work Circle, for those of you who don't know, is starting this August. Spots are already filling up from those who had joined the waitlist. But it's a year-long program for an intimate group of women, 10 women max, who are ready to take the year and prioritize themselves. Get to know who they are, what they really want, what's getting in their way, and helping them just show up more fully in work, in life, as their full, whole, authentic, beautiful, magnificent, that's not a word, magnificent selves. If you want to learn more about this program and get a sense of whether or not it's for you, check out the, again, page in my show notes. All of the information is there. Applications are now open. If you follow me on Instagram, I'll be doing a more formal announcement with some dates and details and additional things there. Thank you guys for tuning in. It's my absolute pleasure and honor every week to be able to bring these conversations to you. If there's someone you know who needed to hear something from this episode today, press that share button, send this episode to them. Show them you're thinking about them. Send them some love. Alrighty. We will catch you on next week's episode. Sincerely, me.